855-237-2346 or 855-AF radio. And of course, if you're watching us on YouTube, you can type in your question in the space provided. And if it's something that's relevant to what we're talking about, that will be forwarded to me. But try to do it before the very end of the program, because sometimes I can't get around to it by then. So tonight we're going to talk about details in the church hymns that are not historical. What do we think about those? But before we get to that, let's begin with our prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Illumine our hearts, O Master who loves mankind, with the pure light of thy divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds to understand thy gospel teachings. Implant in us also the fear of thy blessed commandments, that trampling down all carnal desires, we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things that are well-pleasing to thee. For thou art the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God, and to thee we ascribe glory, together with thy Father who is from everlasting, and thine all holy and good and life-giving Spirit, always, now, and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Well, last week we were saying that we would talk about introduction to patristic interpretation, really by starting with the Jewish interpretation of the church, or the Jewish interpretations and how that affected the church. But, and then I was going to answer this question, because Father Costa hates it, by the way, when I start with a question. He says, don't start with a question, don't do that. And so I guess I thought, okay, I won't start with a question. First, we'll discuss the early Christian interpretation, then we'll get to the question. And as I began to work on it, I realized I would never get to both. So we're going to put off our interpretation until next week, and we're going to address this question because I do believe it's very important. Now, before we get any further, people still ask me, what does stomen kalos mean? Okay, which I begin this show with. Stomen kalos. If you are an Orthodox Christian and attend the Divine Liturgy, you've heard it every single time, even though you didn't recognize it. Right after the congregation states or recites the Nicene Creed, the first thing the priest says is stomen kalos, stomen metaphovu. That means let us stand aright, or literally it means let us stand well. Let us stand firmly. And it's very interesting to me that this is said right after we say the creed. And what the priest is really calling us to do, of course, they're getting ready to consecrate the holy gifts into the body and blood of Christ. But what the priest is calling us to do, the entire congregation, because we just recited the creed, all of us are supposed to say the creed, not just have one person read it. I know there are some churches where I've seen just one person, like the chanter, reading the creed. We're all supposed to say it. It's our statement of faith. And after we've expressed what we believe, the priest says, let us stand firmly. Let us stand well. Stomen kalos. And so this is very important. And I say this because that's what we're trying to do with this program, and what I'm trying to do with whatever I do in the church is to try to encourage people to preserve the Orthodox faith, to stand well and firmly in the faith. So whenever somebody is considering compromising their faith, you could say to them, stomen kalos. That's what it means. So remain faithful. Now, as I said, last week we were talking about the proto-evangelium of James, some of the details that it includes that are not historical. And I received a question about this, because, and it's important that we do discuss it, because I talked about these Christian Apocrypha and how they contain details that are actually not historical. For example, and the example that I gave was this, that the Proto-Evangelium of James has everybody welcoming Mary into the temple. Everybody's rejoicing because the mother of the future Messiah, the future mother of the Messiah, has come to the temple, and Zechariah, the high priest, who is the father of John the Baptist, escorts her into the temple, etc. It also says that Joseph, somebody, when she turned 12, somebody was going to have to be given her to be cared for, and they chose by lot Joseph, and he didn't want it. And then when they find out that she's expecting, she and Joseph are both subject to the test of the bitter waters in the book of Numbers for people who are accused of adultery. I mean, none of this happened. So this is something which is concerning to people, because many people who have discovered the Orthodox faith coming from the Protestant tradition really know their Bibles very well. And they know that some of these details contradict the canonical Gospels. And this is why I said, really, we should not be reading the canonical Gospels. So I received an email, which is the sort of starting off point, the jumping off point for our discussion tonight. And I want to read it to you because it is a question that I have been asked many times. And since we're talking about the Apocrypha, we should address it right now and address it thoroughly. So that's why I didn't leave it till the end, as Father Costa suggested I do, because I was afraid I would just drag out my program too late or I would never get to it. So, of course, this question, remember that when we say Apocrypha as Orthodox Christians, we're talking about fake apostolic writings, not Old Testament books that Martin Luther removed from the Bible and called Apocrypha. We don't mean those. We're talking about fake apostolic writings. So this question arises in connection with the Feast of the Virgin Mary. It comes up literally every year, especially in the fall, when people are going to church and they're hearing these hymns, chanted, or they're looking at the iconography, and it seems to incorporate these details. And they do indeed incorporate the details from the Proto-Evangelium of James, and it's confusing to people. And so I get questions about this. I just do. And it's a crisis for people because they know it's not true. And here the church is promoting these ideas, these details which are not true. By the way, there's a lot of details in the Proto-Evangelium of James that are not incorporated by the church. It doesn't accept everything, just a few things that show up in our hymnology and in our iconography. So I really thought that that was very important that we address it. And then from that, I want you to understand the bigger picture of what it means to be Orthodox, because that's what this program is about. It's helping you to think as an Orthodox Christian. So how do we do that? What does this mean? That we pretend that this is really historical? How do we handle this? That's why we're talking about it tonight. Okay, so here's the email. Hello, Dr. Jeannie. I have been listening to your recent episode of Search the Scriptures Live, and I am a little confused. You have stated that we are not to believe that Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, was the high priest who took Mary into the Holy of Holies, and associate this idea with the Proto-Evangelium of James. I understand that the Proto-Evangelium of James is not the source of this, but this is what the church services say. Okay, so let's pause right here. The church services don't say that the Proto-Evangelium is the source, but it is the source, right? And of course, those are things that the church services say. I didn't say that we shouldn't believe these things, that they come from the Proto-Evangelium of James. They definitely come from the Proto-Evangelium of James. So let's go ahead and continue. And then he gives me some examples. He's quoting, good for you, quoting the services from November 21st that talks about how Mary is brought into the tabernacle. She's greeted by Zacharias, who escorts her into the temple. And then he quotes another hymn about Joachim and Anna, brought her to the temple, and she went up to the top step herself, and she was met by the high priest Zechariah, etc. So he's quoting these things for me, which of course I'm aware of. I also understand that this sounds like it contradicts Luke, but if the services of the church do not represent the teaching of the church, what am I to believe? And this is the reason why I'm answering this. And then let me go on and give you a little bit more of his background and why he's asking the question. On a personal note on this issue, perhaps my question of how we know what the church teaches comes from being a convert to Orthodoxy from Protestantism. When I was a Protestant, I read the Bible in a Protestant way and concluded that the Bible taught Protestantism. A natural conclusion, because that was his phronima. Over time, the cracks in this opened up, and I found myself in the Orthodox Church. Since then, I have tried to allow the church to inform my reading of the scriptures. This then raises the question of what is the church that can inform my reading of the scriptures? Is it the words of the church services? Is it the priest? Is it the fathers? Is it a podcast like yours? Generally, all these things converge, but in the case of the example below, I have been aware of the divergence between the church services and Luke for the first time when I went to the feast day services for the presentation of the Theotokos, and I heard a homily about the high priest Zechariah. On this issue, I have tended toward dealing with this in a manner of what G.K. Chesterton, I understand that he's not Orthodox, would say, quote, the ordinary man sought two truths that seemed to contradict each other. He would take the two truths and the contradiction along with them. This is just a little context on where I'm coming from. Thanks, Greg in Everett, Washington. So thank you so much for the email, Greg, because you're voicing what a lot of people are wondering about. That's why we're going to give this our full attention today. Not just this, but the whole idea behind it, how the church deals with these historical details that don't seem to make sense in the light of the way the church presents things. This is what I'm trying to say, because I know that this bothers people and I understand it. And to tell you the truth, I had to come to terms with these things myself as an Orthodox Christian, because I didn't always know these things. And once I learned them, I had to decide, well, what am I going to believe? How am I going to incorporate this into my life? How do we handle things that seem to be historical contradictions? I don't like contradictions either. Nobody does. But we have to be able to absorb little things like this without it shaking our faith. But when truth is supposed to be aligned with historical facts, then it becomes a problem. But we don't treat it that way in Orthodoxy. And that's why I'm trying to help you develop your Orthodox formula, which, by the way, you did a great job by saying that you've decided to let the church inform how you interpret or understand the Bible. That's perfect. Really perfect. So I thought that was excellent. So Father Hopko of blessed memory also talks about this, I think more at length than I do, especially in relation to the presentation of the temple. So I'm not alone in what I'm telling you about how we understand these issues, the hymnology and the iconography that seem to present things that we know are not historically accurate. Most of the time, the priests don't really discuss this because it kind of opens up a can of worms. As you can see, I'm going to spend at least an hour today talking about it, and it's not something that they can devote that much time to. But here on this podcast, that's what we do. We try to deal with the difficult issues, and I'm glad that you're asking me about it, because this is the place where you can come to try to understand these things that confound and perplex people outside the church. Well, how can you say that if you know that historically it's not accurate? Well, so as I said, first of all, the Proto-Evangelium is the source of those details. I was not intending to suggest that it wasn't. Mary being brought to the temple and led into the temple by Zechariah, that she was brought to the temple, that's not from her, from the Proto-James. But what I was saying is that the basic information that we have about the Theotokos, who her parents were, that she was brought to the temple when she was 3 years old and dedicated to God, that she left and was betrothed to Joseph. Obviously, those things were part of the tradition of the church. They were well known in the early, of course, that she was betrothed to Joseph. That's in the scriptures. But other details about her general life would have been known in the early church way before the Proto-Evangelium of James was written. Okay, so just bear this in mind. I'm sure she didn't talk a lot about herself, but people did know her life. So what did they know? They knew the names of her parents. They knew that she was a product of a birth to two elderly parents, that they had said that they would dedicate her to the Lord, and they did that, and they took her to the temple when she was 3, and she left when she was 12. That's kind of basic outline of her early life. That information would have been known in the church, okay? Now, what happens is 100 years after she's died. So we don't know exactly when she died, but she lived after, if Christ died in 33, and let's say she died in the year 50, the Proto-Evangelium of James is dated around the year 50. So it's 100 years after she died, and, 150 years after she would have been born before Jesus, way before Jesus. So let's say way before, who knows, 90 or 85 BC or something like that. I shouldn't have said that. I'm mixing up my dates, obviously. Let's say she's 12 or 13 when she gets engaged to Joseph. So whatever that is BC, it's not 13. Jesus was born in like 6 BC. So she's born like 15 years or so before that, 12 to 15 years before that. Let's just say that that's the approximate time. So she's born, and way before the Proto-Evangelium of James is written, and these things happen to her that she's taken to the temple. That's my point. So there's no one around when the Proto-Evangelium of James is written who actually knows anything about it from firsthand memory. This is different from the Gospels. The Gospels are written during the last half of the first century, within the lifetimes of the living people who actually knew the Lord. Okay, so this is very, very different. That's my point in saying this. Now, what we do know about her was known by her extended family in the village of Nazareth, and also by the family of Joseph, to whom she was a stepmother, because he already had children by a prior marriage, and then he marries Mary, or call him the betrothed, of course, in the church, but he brings her into his house. She's like a stepmother to his children, and she helps him with the house, and she helps to raise them. So they knew her life. Now, as I said, around the year 150, the Proto-Evangelium of James is written. What the author did was take these basic facts about her life and then try to embellish them and make it a more interesting story. They used their imagination. In other words, they included fanciful elements, exaggerated details, things that never happened. And then, so they wrote this Proto-Evangelium of James. Now, here's the part that I'm going to go a little bit off topic right now. But when people say that Mary was not important in the early church, this obviously shows that she was. There was a lot of curiosity about her. She was obviously an object of veneration, even at this early time, that there was a high, or at least a high regard for her sanctity. It is during the 2nd century, that's still very, very early, that we see prayers addressed to the Virgin Mary as an intercessor, that we see her depicted in church iconography in the catacombs. This is 2nd century, mid-2nd century, very, very early. So regardless of the fact that these very fanciful apocryphal stories aren't necessarily accurate, what it does tell us is how important she was in the early church, and how much there was a fascination with her by the early Christians. There was a devotion toward her by the early Christians. So that's something kind of important. This isn't something that develops later, all right? So, but here's the question. Why would the church accept those details which are not historically accurate? Because the church sees them as representing or reflecting something which is beyond history, something of significant theological meaning. That's why they end up in the hymns of the church. Because, as I said before, there's a lot of things that happen in the Proto-Evangelium of James that are not in the hymns of the church. Actually, very, very few things, very few details end up in the hymns and iconography of the church. So why are those few details incorporated? Not just because they're, fantastic or something like that she lived in the Holy of Holies, but because they have important theological significance. The church is interpreting these things in a specific way that tells us about her and her life. So I said not to read the Proto-Evangelium of James or other Apocrypha because they do not contain any useful historical information. They don't. Okay? They don't. And the reason why that we don't read them is because the fathers tell us not to read them. and they are not really written by apostles. But nonetheless, we have this important information that is already part of the tradition of the church, all right? But the church took whatever details it wanted to from the Proto-Evangelium of James, or whatever it found kind of inspirational or significant for what we could say explaining some theological mystery, and it incorporated those. That doesn't mean that they're accurate. It's just that the church found a way to use this to say something very special about who she is. This is what we're talking about with these Apocrypha. But that doesn't mean that you should read them because they're historical. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is because I have heard priests say, because they want to defend the Proto-Evangelium of James, well, we don't read any other Apocrypha, but we use the Proto-Evangelium of James for history. I cringe when I hear that. They say we don't use it for theology because it's Apocrypha, right? It's not scripture, but we use it for history. But if we can't trust it as history, why would we even say that we're using it for history? That's why I'm trying to tell you that the church knew the basic outline of her life. And then, of course, because the Proto-Evangelium of James was popular, we have people taking some of those elements and incorporating them, very few elements, into the hymns and the iconography of the church. But I want to reiterate why I think it's not useful for you to read these books. They do not contain anything useful. Whatever that is useful, the church already took and is presenting it to you in the feasts of the church. That's why there's nothing more to be gained by that. So people are curious. That's why last time, I think I ended with a quotation from Cyril of Jerusalem, who talks against curiosity, because this is why people wrote these books in the first place. That's why they read them in the second place, because they're curious about the early life of the Virgin or the childhood of Jesus. So somebody wrote up and made up these legends, and then people read them because they're curious, but they are not true. So why should we read them? Especially when we don't know our Bible well enough. This is the part that bothers me. We don't really know the Bible, but we want to read these other books, which are definitely not true. Okay, so priests will say that they're not scripture, but we're still reading them anyhow, or we get this information, and I think it's very, very damaging. Now, I don't want to scandalize anybody, but I want you to understand why I am saying that these things are not historically accurate before I explain to you why the church has them. Because if we have to make a distinction between apocryphal writings and the scriptures, if we choose to defend these, and I've heard people defend these as historically accurate, they have to be accurate because that's what the church says, basically. This has to be true because that's what is in the hymns. What we do is we undermine the historical reliability of the Gospels in the eyes of people. And that's why I'm taking this kind of harsh stand, which is most Orthodox, they just kind of go with the flow with this. They don't make a big deal about it. But I'm very concerned that people will say, why should we believe the Gospels? Why should we believe anything the church says? That was kind of what Greg didn't exactly put it that way, but somebody could who has the same experience. Why should I believe anything the church says if it's teaching me something that's not historical? Well, setting aside those couple of images we're going to talk about momentarily, this is really a problem because it calls into question the truth of the scripture. And I'm trying to protect the Bible, assert that the Bible is trustworthy, not only theologically, but historically as well. So that's why I think it's rather dangerous for us to insist that the Apocrypha are theologically, trustworthy, and we could say historically trustworthy, I should say. We shouldn't insist on that because then people will say, but it's obviously not true because we know that Zechariah was not the high priest, and we know it even from the books that you call scripture. So why should we believe it? So what happens here is this causes people to doubt the historicity and the historical accuracy of the Gospels. So this is why I draw a very hard line about this. So I have to ask myself, because a lot of people say, oh no, this is true, this is true, this is true. She really went into the Holy of Holies and she was led there by Zechariah, the high priest, and blah, blah, blah. Well, because they feel like they have to defend the church. But we don't have to defend the way the church uses this, because this has a different meaning. I'm going to talk about it. But my point is, we can either defend the Apocrypha as being historically accurate because we want to defend the way that they're used in the hymns of the church, or we can defend the Gospels. I think it's much more important to assert and affirm and preserve the truth of the Gospels. They can't both be true. Either Zechariah was a high priest, or as Luke says, the evangelist, he was one of the ordinary priests and it was his turn to serve. Do you see what I'm trying to say? We can't both assert both things as true. So it's more than that. There's a contradiction, and that, G.K. Chesterton said, we're just going to accept both contradictions. We don't. Okay. But anyhow, let's take a little break here. When we come back, I'm going to explain to you why how the church has come to use these details and what they really mean. Okay. So join me after the break.
So here's a question for you. What does it mean to think Orthodox? What are the unspoken and unexplored premises and presumptions underlying what Christians believe? Orthodox Christianity is based on preserving the mind of the early church, its phronima. Dr. Jeannie Constantinou brings her more than 40 years' experience as a professor, Bible teacher, and speaker to bear in explaining what the Orthodox phronima is, how it can be acquired, and how that phronima is expressed in true Orthodox theology, as practiced by those who are properly qualified by both training and a deep relationship with Christ. Thinking Orthodox, now available at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
Okay, so I'm saying that I don't think we have to affirm that the Apocrypha are historically accurate, or even that the hymns of the church are historically accurate in order to have these hymns in our church. I don't think we have to make excuses for them. We don't have to say that they're historically accurate. We don't have to justify them. Why can't we just enjoy them? Why can't we just enjoy the imagery of them? What it comes down to is that these are poetic expressions, and I'm going to tell you what they mean. But I want you to understand that the church knew the basic outline of her life and did not get that information from the Proto-Evangelium of James. This is the part that bothers me the most. When priests say, where do you get the Feast of the Virgin Mary? We get them from the Proto-Evangelium of James. To say that the church did not know who her parents were, or that she was taken to the temple when she was 3 years old and dedicated to God, that they only learned about that 150 years after her death from the Proto-Evangelium of James, which is a false writing. Can you see the problem there? So please, please, please don't say that we get this information from the Proto-Evangelium of James. What we get are a couple of the images, and those have inspired some of the hymnology and the iconography of the church. Now, this has become an issue in recent years because of the influx into the church of former Protestants like Greg. And this is why I'm addressing it, because as I said, I want to give you an Orthodox mentality, which I'm very proud to see that Greg is already accomplishing this, because he has decided to let the church inform him about his understanding of the scriptures. That's what we ought to be doing. So this is my personal opinion when I'm saying that we should not insist on that these details are historically accurate. I'm telling you this again because what I've heard out there, I had somebody actually tell me that her priest, this was a while ago, and I don't even remember where it was, so don't, I'm not accusing anybody here. Somebody told me that her priest insisted that she had to believe all of these things. Otherwise, she's not really Orthodox, okay? She had to believe that everything was historically accurate. And I'm telling you that this is very problematic. That is not true. The church does not demand or obligate us to accept that every single thing in the hymns are historically accurate, okay? Because we don't look to the history as giving the spiritual meaning. We look at the spiritual meaning. We look at the theological meaning. Every detail of Proto-James was not incorporated, only a few details, because those were the ones that give some theological meaning, okay? Now, by the way, if you wish to believe that these things are historically true, you can. There's no great harm in it. You can believe that if you want to. People believe it and they love it. I know people who love these sort of fanciful stories about the Virgin Mary, and I'm not here to burst your bubble. I'm here to tell you that you can ignore it. If it's historically inaccurate and it bothers you, you're supposed to be looking for the deeper theological meaning. That's up to you. The church does not insist that you believe in these things. We are not a church of obligation. We are a church of freedom. Believe it or not, that's true. And I'm here to tell you that if your priest tells you you have to believe it, he's not thinking like an Orthodox person, because Orthodoxy allows freedom about these things. This is not doctrine. This is not dogma. This is, a poetic expression that's found in the hymns of the church. What is the doctrine of the church? That she was taken to the church and taken to the temple and dedicated to God there, and she lived there, okay, until it was time for her to become the mother of the Messiah. That's the doctrine. So the other things are just embellishments for spiritual reflection, for theological meaning. Okay, we're going to get to that but in the meantime, we have a question about this that came in on SpeakPipe, and Mike is going to play it right now, and I'll answer it.
Hi, Dr. Jeannie. You said in your last episode that we know the Theotokos was dedicated to the temple and spent her childhood there, and that we know this by tradition. I wondered about the norms of the time. Why would a little girl spend her childhood at the temple if she was just going to come out and be married and then lead a normal life in the community? Did this happen often? Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks for the question. It's a very good question because and I understand why you're not the first person to ask me this question. There was no expectation of lifelong virginity in the Jewish world, in Judaism. This is something that really comes with Christianity, where people decide to devote themselves to Christ and become a monastic. That didn't exist in Judaism. The Jews feel very strongly that the most important thing you can do is have children and have lots of them. And that was really the Jewish tradition. So people were expected to marry. And that would go for most men too, but not all men. We know that some of the prophets were not married. Certainly John the Forerunner was not married, and Jesus was not married. There were some men who never married, but the general idea in Judaism was that people get married. Now, was it common? I don't think it was common. We know this from the Old Testament, of course. We have the story of Samuel. And his mother, Hannah, had prayed for years and years and years to have a baby. She didn't have any, and she suffered a lot because of this. And so she prays to the Lord, and she says that if he gives her a baby, she will dedicate him to the Lord. So that's little baby Samuel. And when he was 3 years old, he was taken to the tabernacle. That's before they had a temple, the tabernacle, and left in the case of Eli, in the charge of Eli. Now, he ends up becoming the high priest because both of Eli's sons are corrupt, and they both die before their time. So they don't inherit the high priesthood. Instead, it goes to Samuel. So he ends up becoming the high priest. But it's not necessary. And frankly, the fact is, unless you were already part of a priestly family, you can't just grow up and become a priest and decide you want to be a priest. You have to be born into that tribe and the right part of the tribe. So simply because that happened with Samuel doesn't mean that he would have ordinarily become the high priest. But here's the point. This was the option. you either brought a lamb or 2 turtle doves 40 days after the birth of your son, and you offered them as sacrifice to the Lord, or 80 days after the birth of your daughter, and you brought them as sacrifice to the Lord, or after 3 years, you brought that child to the temple and dedicated them to God. The sacrifice at 40 days for boys or 80 days for girls was something that was done. You sort of bought your child back. You offered the Lord the sacrifice and you redeemed your child back. That's what it was. Okay, so Mary and Joseph don't leave Jesus there. If they were planning on leaving Jesus there, they wouldn't have offered the sacrifice of 2 turtle doves on the 40th day of his birth. Instead, they would have just taken him home until he was 3 years old and brought him back to the temple. So that's what has happened here. It wasn't common. You can imagine. It's just not common. But nonetheless, it happened occasionally. And the Virgin Mary is one example of that. Okay, so that is something. I hope that answers your question. Now, all right. So let's go ahead and talk about the kinds of these historical details. Now, these are the things that St. John Chrysostom would call damikra. And these are, in other words, little things, little things, insignificant details. So part of our modern sensibility is that we insist on historical accuracy, and we assume that that means truth. But I just want you to consider the fact that even when there are historical events, they are interpreted somehow or another. So they're given different meanings. We're having that right now. Whenever there is something historical that's taking place, you have people of different political parties that are interpreting the events quite differently, aren't there? Okay. So the Orthodox Church does not insist on the historical accuracy of something for it to have theological meaning. And very, very often, the Church does not really regard or consider particularly important something which happens historically, because the hymnology and the iconography of the Church are teaching the doctrine of the Church, not bare history. And this is what we see in the iconography of the Church. So what does it mean that Zechariah was presented as leading the Theotokos into the temple? I would say that this is a foreshadowing of the fact that his father, John, the forerunner, would lead the way before Christ. Can you see the parallel there? There's a parallel that's being created there. That just as she was led, because Zacharias, of course, is going to have himself is going to become the father of the forerunner. She's led into the temple by Zechariah. He's later going to become the father of the person who will prepare the way for the Lord. This is what I'm trying to say. I think that this is the significance of that. There's a kind of mirroring, a kind of sort of a type of typology there. But there are other details which are not historical that find their way into these stories and into the theology of the Church, especially that she lived in the Holy of Holies. So why would somebody say that she lived in the Holy of Holies? Somebody who's writing this, but who long after the temple is destroyed, who's not Jewish, who knows nothing about the temple, would say, well, where would Mary live if she was living at the temple? Well, the appropriate place would be in the Holy of Holies. Of course, she can't live there. That would have been impossible for her to live in. But this makes sense to an early pious person who's trying to write stories about her life. Now, why does the Church choose to incorporate that into its theology or its hymnology? Not because it's historically accurate and they want you to cling to this as historically accurate, but because it's theologically appropriate. Okay? She herself, the Virgin Mary, became the Holy of Holies. She would contain within her own womb God, who is uncontainable, the uncontainable God. So that's representing what she would become. The holy place, the Holy of Holies, is what she physically would become, the place, because the Holy of Holies was considered to be the dwelling place of God. It's where the Ark of the Covenant was. At the time of the Second Temple, there was no Ark there, but you have the Ark of the Covenant there, or the space which once contained it. It was the holiest space in the whole world. So eventually, the holiest space in the whole world becomes the womb of the Virgin, who is containing God himself, the incarnate God himself. So this is the meaning of that. So listen, again, as I said, if you want to insist that this really happened historically, you can. But this is just disturbing to people who know that these things would not have happened historically. But what we should see, and frankly, I think it's more important that we see in these things the theological meaning, the spiritual meaning. These are the things we should be thinking about, not whether or not it's historically accurate, because history doesn't project all truth. So some things are true, even though they are not historically accurate. Okay, this is what it's trying to say. It's trying to teach us something more important than historical accuracy. Now, this is something which we see in other places in our hymnology and in our iconography, and I wanted to talk to you about that. For example, during the Feast of Epiphany, we have, or there are even some prayers of the church, we have language that says, when you came to be baptized, O Lord, and you entered the Jordan, the waters were afraid and they turned back. In other words, the flow of the water stopped. The river started to run backwards because it was afraid of the Lord. That's not historically accurate. It's an image. So it's trying to express something very deep about the fact that Christ was about to be baptized. The person who created water is about to be baptized and the water is afraid, okay? But we have a lot of images like this during Holy Week in which the hymnographers of the church are reflecting on the deep meaning of these things. And then what they describe is not really historically accurate, but it's profoundly meaningful. And it's what the people in the hymns would have said had they known what they were really doing, what was really happening. So I'll give you an example. I found this in the Apostica of Great Friday Vespers about Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph of Arimathea took you, the life of all, now dead, from the cross. He buried you with fine linen, anointed you with myrrh, and embraced your pure body, rejoicing as he cried out to you, "Glory to your condescension, O merciful God." So most of that is true, right? He took down the body of Jesus, he buried it, he wrapped it, and all this. But I don't think he was rejoicing. And I don't think he was calling glory to your condescension, O merciful God. So how does that fit in with what we're doing? We're saying glory to your condescension. We are taking the place of Joseph in voicing those things because it is true what he was doing, that he was burying God. That's true. So we have to understand that the church doesn't really live in a state of past and even present and future. The church really sees everything on one plane in a lot of ways. That's why so often in our hymns we say, today is hung upon the tree, him who suspended the land in the midst of the waters. Today, the angel comes and tells the Virgin Mary, "Si meron." We say that all the time in our hymns because for us, we're living in that present moment. We're living in the moment, which would have been the historical past. But for us, it becomes alive again. It becomes something that's real for us today. And so that's what the church is looking at here. It's as if the people in the hymns or in the icons know what's going to happen in the future, even though they really didn't at the moment. Okay, they know it now. So when we say that everybody rejoiced that the Virgin Mary had been brought to the temple, at that time, nobody knew that she was going to give birth to the Messiah. That's the historical reality. But we're celebrating the feast now. Okay, so we're rejoicing that she was brought to the temple, but it's the present for us in the language of the church and the way that we celebrate it. So we're joining heaven and we're celebrating something that is outside of the realm of time. So that's how we understand these things as Orthodox Christians. So let me read another one for you. This is the doxastikon of Great Friday Vespers. This is even more powerful. You who clothe yourself with light as with a garment, Joseph and Nicodemus brought you down from the cross, and seeing you dead, naked, and unburied, they deeply lamented, and grieving, they said, Woe to me, sweetest Jesus, when but a short while ago the sun beheld you hanging on the cross and shrouded itself in darkness, and the earth quaked with fear, and the veil of the temple was rent asunder. All of that is historically true, right? But now, this is Joseph and Nicodemus saying this. Now I see that you willingly underwent death for my sake. How then shall I array you for burial, my God? How shall I wrap you in a shroud? With what hands can I touch your sacred body? What dirges shall I chant for your funeral, O merciful one? I magnify your passion. I praise your burial and resurrection with hymns. I cry aloud, Lord, glory to you. This is unbelievable. This is poetry of the highest caliber. And so it's voicing something which didn't really happen historically. The thing that happened, just like Mary literally spent and lived at the temple, maybe not inside the temple, but she lived at the temple. She was dedicated to God. But what the church draws out is the deeper mystery with those images that we find in the hymnology of the church. And so this is what we see the same thing throughout Holy Week. I'll give you one more. This is kind of one of my favorites. And some of you might recognize these hymns. On Holy Saturday, the Divine Liturgy of Holy Saturday, we say, Today, Hades cried out groaning, Would that I had not received the one born of Mary. He came and destroyed my power. He shattered the gates of brass. Don't we say that all the time in the hymns? That Christ descended to Hades and shattered the gates of brass. The resurrection icon, he's standing on the broken doors. There's little keys and locks scattered about, broken locks scattered about, chains that are broken and things like this. Well, is that historically accurate? It's historically accurate that he died. It's theologically true that he went to Hades. When he went to Hades, did he break down iron bars and break chains and things like that? No, but that doesn't mean it's not true in its own way, because it's trying to express something for us to be able to imagine it, for us to understand the meaning of what happened, okay? That the life in Hades is a spiritual existence, but we don't look at the icon and say, oh, that's not historically accurate. You see my point? We try to understand the deep theological truths that are being conveyed. So this is the greater lesson here. It's about the Orthodox mind. It's about our phronima. We do not think rigidly. This is not Orthodox. The church accepts the mystery, and then it tries to convey it to us in a way that expresses these things which are far deeper than mere history, you see. The Christians knew this. The church interprets the theology, its history theologically. Let me say that again. The church interprets history theologically. Let's take the cross for an example. Everybody knows that Jesus died on the cross. By the way, most Muslims don't believe that, because it was such a shameful way to die that most Muslims do not believe that Jesus actually died on the cross. They think, and that's in one of the Apocrypha, that's what I'm telling you, they're not historically accurate. They think that somebody else who looked a lot like Jesus was crucified by mistake in his place, or that Simon of Cyrene, who was carrying the cross for Jesus, was crucified by mistake in the place of Jesus, that Jesus was never crucified, because God would never allow that to happen to his prophet. That's what most Muslims think. But so other than the Muslims, Christians know Jesus died on the cross, Jews know it, Hindus know it, Buddhists know it. But what difference does that make? The historical fact doesn't impact anybody. It's not important in that regard. It doesn't tell us what the cross means theologically. That's why the bare history is not sufficient. That's why we don't look to the history. We look to the theology behind it. And so only the church can tell us what it means. I'll give you another example, and this is something that we see at the Divine Liturgy with the use of leavened bread. All right, so the church used leavened bread. Now, for some reason, this changed in the Middle Ages in the West, and they were saying that, well, it's a Passover meal. So if it's a Passover meal, it would have been unleavened bread, and we should use unleavened bread. Well, we could argue that historically Jesus was using leavened bread. I mean, there's an argument to be made for that because that's the word that's used in the Bible. When Jesus says, takes bread in his hands and breaks it, the word that's being used there is leavened bread. But people say, well, it was a Passover meal that wouldn't have had, well, it wasn't exactly a Passover meal because the Passover hadn't happened. I don't want to get into this argument over history, but the leavened bread has tremendous historical significance. So even if the church was not using leavened bread, or even if Jesus was not using leavened bread, the church uses leavened bread because leavened bread contains yeast and it rises. And so the leavened bread represents the resurrection. To use unleavened bread is like a denial of the resurrection. So these things in the life of the church, whether they are objects like the form of bread that we use. Oh, another example is red wine. We use only red wine, and it's sweet wine. It's not, dry wine. In the Orthodox Church, we have to use red wine. We have to use sweet wine. In the Catholic Church, they can use white wine. And that really shocked me when I found that out. Of course, I already knew about the unleavened bread, but for them, it is the kind of wine. It just has to be wine. It has to be unleavened bread. They say it was a Passover meal. The kind of wine doesn't matter. But for us, these things have tremendous theological significance. Has to be sweet because Christ is sweet. It's not going to be sour wine or something which is sharp. It has to be something sweet, and it has to be red because it represents his blood. It is his blood. It becomes his blood. So it has to look like his blood. Okay? So the point is here that when we are trying to shape our Orthodox mind, we have to understand that we don't think in rigid concepts. We don't think in a rigid way. We can't say, well, this is historical, so this is why we should do it this way, or this is not historical, so we shouldn't have it. The church expresses a mystery and things that cannot be comprehended by the human mind. It expresses these things in a poetic manner. So the hymns of the church are poetry, and even though they may not be literally true or historically true, they're conveying something which is far, far deeper. So, we all grew up studying poetry in school, and you might say, so there might be a poem that says something like, my love is like a red, red rose. Well, that's not historically accurate. Your love, or it's not even a description, your love, unless she's very round and very red, she's not looking anything like a rose. Obviously, that's an image that is being used to convey something much deeper. And when we hear it as poetry, we understand it. So that's how you ought to understand the hymns of the church. And we don't have to remain rigidly tied to historical accuracy and insist that if we don't have them, either they have to be historically accurate or they're not true. They're expressing something far beyond that. Now, somebody asked a question. I wasn't sure if I was even going to get into this tonight, but it has come up. Question on YouTube. Someone wanted to know if you were invited to speak during what appeared to be a homily during the Divine Liturgy, why a woman would be able to give a sermon. And that's not really our subject matter for tonight, but it has come up again recently. It does come up repeatedly. So I just want to say the following about that, about myself personally, because I do want to talk about also the iconography of the church. That's more important. Let me go ahead and talk about that very briefly. The Orthodox have different views on this. In the Russian tradition, they tend not to allow women to preach in church, but the Greeks generally do or often do. And so here again, we have to look not rigidly at what you know from your own or what you're reading about in online or something like this. I know there's been a lot of condemnation about myself personally. I do wear a black robe when I preach, and I wear that because whenever I serve in church, like even as a chanter, I'm robed. In the Greek Orthodox tradition, chanters wear robes, and what I'm wearing is a chanter's robe. It has a red collar, it has a red inner lining in the sleeves. It's a chanter's robe. I'm not trying to look like a priest, but I don't believe in preaching in my street clothes. I wear the hymn. I wear the cross of our school of theology because that's where I get my knowledge from, my Orthodox education. I only preach with the permission of the bishop when a priest asks me, and I preach where he tells me to, and where the priest tells me to, and when he tells me to. So that's up to the priest. Now, how is it that women can preach in church? Well, in the early, people will say, well, women are to be silent in the churches. So here's my question for you. Are we Orthodox or are we not? If we're Orthodox and we say we follow the fathers, then we have to understand what Paul meant when he said women should be silent in the churches. I've already spoken about this, but not about myself personally. I don't really like to bring myself into the equation, but I'll give you just a very brief answer. St. John Chrysostom, when he's explaining what St. Paul meant in 1 Corinthians, when he said women must be silent in the churches, he said it doesn't mean that they never spoke in church. He says that they are not to carry on conversations in the church because we tend to be kind of chatty. And the reason why St. Paul said this, and Chrysostom explains this, he says that St. Paul had women who were teachers, and he admits the fact, and he says this, that Chrysostom draws his conclusion based on the context. How is it that St. Paul says women are to be silent when women were prophesying in the church and women were speaking in tongues in the church? Well, you can't prophesy silently. What did it mean that a woman was giving a prophecy in the church? What do you think it meant? She just blurted out the weather for next week? She was instructing the church. That's what prophecy was. So in the early church, women did prophesy in the church, in the services, and they did speak in tongues. This is part of the early church, and we know that women preached. Why is it that women pretty much stopped that? Because women were generally uneducated. Until recently, women were uneducated. But we have had women baptizers, women preachers, women healers, etc. So it's not impossible for a woman to do this, but she has to do it with the permission of her bishop at the request of the parish priest. And if she has an Orthodox theological education, this is something which does happen in Greek Orthodox parishes. Because here's another thing I think it's important to recognize. In Greece, there are, and also in Russia, there are a lot of lay theologians. That means that there are people who do teach and even preach. Now, in the church, there's no distinction among lay people, but there is among the clergy. So the clergy are the ones who sanctify us. The clergy are the ones who give us the holy sacraments. The sermon is not that. The sermon is a teaching moment. The sermon is explaining the feast day, the gospel reading, or whatever. That is not a sacerdotal, that means priestly function. That's a teaching function. The Roman Catholics restrict that only to priests and deacons and bishops, of course. But the early church didn't. Okay? And this kind of rigidity is something that we're seeing among some people who are coming to the Orthodoxy from very kind of fundamentalist backgrounds, who are arguing that women should never be able to say anything in the church. Well, then they shouldn't sing either, because then they're making sounds in the church. So I understand that some people don't understand this, and they've been criticizing me online for giving sermons in church. But when I'm asked by a priest to preach, and he tells me when and where he wants me to stand, and I'm invited, and it's with approval of the bishop, which it always is, and my own bishop and my own husband and my own spiritual father don't forbid me from doing that, then I go ahead and give the sermon. And I don't think that should be shocking to people. As a matter of fact, we should allow women to contribute their talents to the church. And as I said, Chrysostom said that the main place where St. Paul says women are to be silent, St. John Chrysostom says he means not to be carrying on conversations in the church. And he gets that interpretation, or he arrives at that interpretation, because he says earlier in the same letter, St. Paul says, when a woman prophesies, she should cover her head. And that means that she's speaking in church. Okay, so now I went a little bit over. We're going to take a break. When we come back, I want to point out to you elements of the iconography of the church, which are not historical. Okay, and that's how we're going to close our lesson today. So join me after the break. Okay, so I'm going to add one other thing to that discussion. Again, I don't really like to talk about myself, but since this is becoming some kind of a big issue, let me just say the following. Another passage that people point to, which was from his epistle to Timothy, St. Paul's epistle to Timothy, where he says, I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. Now, the word there, that's translated as authority in English. I've discussed all this before. I apologize to those of you who are long listening followers of this program, because you've heard this before. We talked about it when we discussed the epistles of St. Paul. The word there that is translated as authority is not the ordinary word for authority, which is exousia. The word that St. Paul uses there is authentia. And Chrysostom talks about this too, authentia, but not in his homilies on Timothy. He says that the word authentia means that it is the highest level of authority. Authentia, we don't have an English word for that. I do not permit a woman to have authentia over a man. That means the responsibility of a bishop or a king. So in other words, he says women are not allowed to speak from the vima. This is what Chrysostom says. Okay, that means that they can speak, but not from the vima, which is to represent, in other words, take the place of a bishop or a priest, which she's not doing. So thank you for the question. I don't know whether or not you liked the answer, but this is what I'm going to do. And I have to say that there has been a lot of attacks directed toward me, especially recently. I don't know why, but there are people who feel like it's their duty as Orthodox to make sure that women are silent in church, or I guess out of church too. There's this idea that somehow they're going to preserve Orthodoxy. And of course, I'm talking about that all the time. If I wasn't convinced that it was patristic and that it was something that did happen in the early church, if I didn't have the permission of my bishop, the bishop where I go, the priest where I go, my own husband and my spiritual father, to preach in church, I wouldn't be doing it. It's not about me. It's about doing whatever the priest asks me to do when I go to a parish that he thinks is going to be instructive or informative. So in the Greek tradition, not all of you are following the Greek tradition. You're in some other forms of Orthodoxy, other jurisdictions of Orthodoxy, where you may not see women. Sometimes they don't allow the women even to read the epistle. But this is something which ought to be allowed, and women ought to be encouraged to participate as much as possible, because as lay people, they are equal to men. There's only one priest in most parishes. He's the only one that can consecrate things. But everybody else is a lay person. And whatever a lay man can do, a lay woman can do. This is what St. Paul meant when he said, in Christ there is neither male nor female. Now, that doesn't mean we have the same roles exactly. Only men can become priests. But nonetheless, in terms of what women were doing in church and what men were doing in church, administrators, prophets, preachers, baptizers, these things were all open to women. And they were done by women in the early church. Okay, now enough about me. Let's get to what I wanted to talk about in terms of the iconography of the church. This is a beautiful icon of Christ, and it is, maybe Simon might have to pull back for this. I don't know. I hope you can see it. It's not historically accurate, but isn't it wonderful? It's not historically accurate. Why not? Because the iconography of the church is not intended to teach history. And the history is there. Jesus was crucified. That's a reality. He really bled. And so in the wounds of the Lord that we see on the icons, there are small amounts of blood. You can see this whenever you see an icon of the Lord. Here's his pierced side. There's a small amount of the blood and water. There's blood at his hands and his feet. All of those places have blood. That's historically accurate. But look how otherwise perfect he looks, right? He's the perfect specimen of a human. He was the perfect human. So you see his six-pack abs, and he's not marked. He's not disfigured. He's not ugly, but we do have the blood to show the theological reality that Christ really bled. He was truly human, but he's also presented as a perfect human. There's other things that are so important about the iconographic depiction of the crucifixion. Notice that his hands are laid flat against the wood, not, like clenched like we see in Western art. The flat hands placed flat against the wood symbolizes that he placed himself, or he accepted the cross voluntarily. That's what that means. And notice how his face looks. He doesn't look like he's in pain. We don't deny that he was in pain, but he looks peaceful because he accepted the will of God. He accepted the cross by his own free will, you see? What else do we see? That his body is so beautiful. There's a lovely curvature to the body. He seems to be standing on a little platform. Well, we know that he didn't stand on a little platform. They didn't stand on platforms, but this allows him. Otherwise, his knees would be extremely bent if he was nailed to the upright beam. The knees would be very bent. The legs would be very bent. That's how they actually crucified people. But here we have this beautiful presentation of the Lord. And what else do we see? Of course, at the very top, the titulus. It doesn't say Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. That's historical. Instead, it says King of Glory, because that's what he was at that moment. So you see, both the hymnology and the iconography of the church are not designed to portray history as it actually was, but what it meant theologically and spiritually for us. So I hope that is helpful to you. And now, next week, we will begin talking about early Christian scripture and its interpretation, the interpretation that we see in the scriptures themselves. And then we're going to be taking a couple of weeks off for Holy Week and for Bright Monday. But for now, let's go ahead and close with our prayer. I'm Dr. Jeannie Constantini. You've been listening to Search the Scriptures Live, and this has been a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio. Lord, now let your servants depart in peace according to your word, for our eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all peoples, a light to enlighten the Gentiles and the glory of your people Israel. Amen. Good night.
Depart in peace according to thy word. For mine eyes have seen thy salvation, O